Welcome, everyone, to the Open Learning Reunion. Yay! Jazz hands. So this is a reunion for Open Learning 17, which was the first iteration of the Connectivist MOOC, Open Learning 18, which, as you can guess, was the second iteration, and then Open Learning 19, which is the iteration that we are just finishing up. And in the Zoom with me are Gardner Campbell, who was Hub Director for Open Learning 17 and 18. I'm Sue Erickson. I'm Hub Director for 19. Stephanie Blackmon has been with us since Open Learning 17. She was one of the original steering committee members, as were Gardner and I, and then stayed on for 18 and has jumped back in for 19 this time as well. And I see we have Mo Pelzel with us, and he has been hanging out with Open Learning as a participant ever since 17, so that's exciting. And hopefully we've got other folks tweeting, and I encourage people to blog about this. What is your favorite memory from Open Learning, or what was your favorite experience from any of the iterations of Open Learning? We thought it would be just fun to have a little reunion in Zoom and talk about that. So, Gardner, do you have a favorite memory to put you on the spot? You probably have a lot of them, but do you want to share?
No, well, I have a lot of memories. Many of them are happy, some of them not so much. Mostly what I remember is how it took a long time to get everything up and going. And it's a lesson to anyone who wants to get anything up and going, a lesson that all of us in the Zoom room right now have learned again and again. This one was a little different in my experience. It began with a surprise. Suddenly, a couple of folks from Chev pulled me into the hallway during an otherwise not very interesting meeting, I have to say, and said, would you be interested in phase 2 of this LEAP project called Faculty Collaboratives? I said, what's that? And they went on and explained it. And it turned out that someone I had met the year before, Susan Albertine, had actually recommended that they contact me. So that was about 2 years before Open Learning 17, and it took a good long while to try to explain to Joe and Beverly what I had in mind. First, I had to have something in mind, so that took a little while. And then it was kind of difficult to write up what we were writing up for the Faculty Collaboratives people and for Susan Albertine. She had already been exposed to some of my craziness up at Georgetown, so she kind of knew the job was dangerous. And, I tried to explain to her what I had in mind, and that was, it was difficult because what we've done in Open Learning is so different, I think, from the approaches that other people have taken in the Faculty Collaboratives project. And it is difficult to explain how the network is the deliverable. I wish I'd had that mantra when I was trying to explain it originally, but I guess my top of mind favorite memory is, for all the stuff I knew and had done going into this, I learned so much in the doing of it. And I learned that from other people, learning from other people's modes of participation, getting to meet people I would never have met otherwise, including, I knew Mo, but I didn't know Sue, I didn't know Stephanie, I didn't know Mark Corbett Wilson, the California guy who's coming up from a life in the profession of, he's like a maker of something. I can't remember now what it was. And yet now coming back into higher ed, he's saying, well, why aren't we farther along in any of this? And I was like, yeah, that's a good question. Welcome to Open Learning 17. And all these people, even this time in a fairly short framework, and really not as, it didn't have the same big launch, the big crowd, et cetera. But there are still people coming along and saying, whoa, I never knew. And every time somebody says, whoa, I never knew, I learned something. Even if I knew that already, I I didn't know the trajectory of the learning, or, I didn't have that same feeling of, oh, that's interesting, huh? So it really isn't apparent in these ways. And so that's just been really valuable for me. And I'll stop there. I won't get into the unhappy memories, but it's been quite an interesting set of learnings for me about what some of my own non-negotiables about open. People say a lot about open, and I had been saying a lot about open before we ever did this, and had already had some feeling as far back as 2012 that maybe open was not going to be, just the answer to everything. I had already, worried about that. But this time I think I really did find, okay, here's the places I've got to stand. Here are the places I can't quite go. Here are the places I was right about. Here are the places maybe I didn't have that right. And so that's been really exciting. And it's really the thing that I love the most about teaching and about leadership, is the chance to put things together in a way where all of this unanticipated learning can occur. I just, so that's those are happy things.
I think one of the things you're talking about that I find kind of fascinating is that the whole impetus behind the learning design, I think, is to set up something for participants that involves learning by doing. So you learn to connect with people by setting up a Twitter account if you don't have one, and using the hashtag and tweeting out your response to things. You learn how to participate through blogging by doing that, and by interacting with the blogs of the other participants. And so to hear you as really the main architect of this whole experience, you had a lot of help, but you were the main architect, talking about yourself learning by doing is fascinating. That it's working on, that learning by doing is working on multiple levels. So I'm just having a very meta moment when we're talking about that. For those of you in the Zoom, if you want to share something, either just, wave your hand so I can see it, or pop into the chat. I want to be sure I don't miss anything there. And I'll just mention that Stephanie is also monitoring our Twitter hashtags to pull in, and so at some point she may share something that is not sharing something from herself, but from another participant, because we're hoping to get some of the other voices into this reunion. So, Stephanie, you were on the original steering committee, so you've been along for the ride for the whole time, and in fact, for the person who was the person who brought me into the group. What are some of your favorite memories from any of the open learning experiences?
So I think I'll talk about maybe what surprised me. So being on Twitter is one thing, and I've talked about the Twitter stories before. Being on Twitter is one thing, but thinking about the fact that this was very much by design a connectivist MOOC, and wanting people to know that and to understand that and what that meant for our expectations for interacting with each other, that Twitter was an enormous part of that, and the Twitter chats. So originally, I was concerned that the Twitter chats could be unwieldy. And I went, oh my goodness, we're all going to be out here at the same time on this internet, wide open on Twitter, right? So
crazy
things happening and hashtagging. And so it's one thing when you're doing it just yourself. It's a completely different matter altogether when you're trying to follow along with these hashtags and really make sure that people feel connected and that they haven't just tweeted and just out there somewhere with no one to attach to it or connect with it in any way. And those went so well. And it was such a wonderful experience because you got to hear from people. Maybe you all weren't following each other at all, but through this open learning experience, you were able to say, hey, here's another person who's thinking about some of the things that I'm thinking about, or wow, that's a completely new idea. And being able to use the mechanism in that way to connect with people by design with a connectivist MOOC. It was really wonderful to see that come to fruition every single time, and then to have those housed on the Open Learning Hub so that people who weren't able to participate in the actual chat don't feel left out, or when they're able to log on later on in the evening, they're still able to participate and we can retweet and like and do all of those things. So I thought that that was a very exciting aspect of the Open Learning, well, each iteration of Open Learning, in fact.
The Twitter chats, I still remember that first Twitter chat in Open Learning 17, which was my first contact with Mo, actually. And Mo, you're up next, by the way, but I'll just use this as a segue because I remember the instructions were that we could, either describe our space for the others in the Twitter chat or do a little video. And Mo, I think you did a video because I remember thinking, wow, I can see him. I can see him in his office. I can see the view out his window. But I just feel like that gave me such a stronger connection to you, Mo, than I had with some other people, because somehow seeing you in your space, hearing you describe your space, really just made a really strong connection for me. And then when we got to meet face to face at EDUCAUSE Eli, it was like, wow, here he is. He's real in the flesh. It was very exciting. One of the things I thought I would share is the opportunity to work globally. So for me in Open Learning 17, as a member of the steering committee, I was asked to direct one of the weeks. And I was actually co-directing with Meheb Ali from University of Cairo in Egypt. And so it was working across time zones, which I hadn't done before. And figuring out ways to collaborate. And so that was a really rich and rewarding part of the experience. Neha is the founder of Virtually Connecting. So one of the things that she had suggested was that we offer a virtually connecting opportunity to people to tune into an Open Ed conference that was happening in South Africa. She set that up, and I was just going to let her take care of that. That would be her piece. I'd watch the video later. That was my plan. And then by then I had kind of gotten the bug, the Open Learning bug, and realized that it really is all about engaging. And engaging, yes, asynchronously sometimes, but really taking advantage of those synchronous opportunities like the Twitter chats. And so I decided to get up in the dark extra early, get ready extra early, because I was going to be in a Google Hangout and potentially someone might see me, so I couldn't be there in my pajamas, much as that sounded really cozy. And after I let Maha know that I was going to be in it actively, she said, well, why don't you monitor the Twitter chat or the chat in the Google Hangout? So I thought, okay, I think I can handle that, and I'm still in the novice part of my novice to node journeys. And it was such a rewarding experience. It was so worth getting up in the dark. I was connecting with people who were really active in the Open Ed movement, and starting to realize, oh wow, this is a movement, and I think I've just joined it. And here I am with people on the other side of the globe having a conversation. And so that was one of my favorite moments from 17. That was really, really exciting. Do others, Stephanie, is there anything coming in on the chat?
We have something from Amy, who was one of our steering committee members as well, from a little bit earlier, and a few of her favorite moments were meeting kindred spirits, the Twitter chats, and annotating with hypothesis.
Those Twitter chats get rave reviews, and we did not do as much of that this time. I guess we didn't do any of that this time in 19, but it was such a shorter duration. We had to pick and choose. But I know that definitely has been a highlight for some folks in 17 and 18. I was thinking back to Open Learning 18 about favorite memories from that experience. And I think for me, that was getting involved in these video interviews and doing that for the first time. And had a chance to do one with Trudy Jacobson and Craig Gibson, who were really fundamental in developing the framework for information literacy, which all the librarians in the audience will know well and perhaps love. So that was a really exciting experience, and that's on the Hub, that's on our YouTube channel, and it's exciting because anybody can go back to it at any time. So they talked about their work in developing the framework for information literacy, and also they had a then forthcoming, now out book on meta-literacy. And then after OpenLearning 18 ended, Gardner and I went to the Connected Learning Summit at MIT and presented about OpenLearning 17 and 18 and drumming up excitement for OpenLearning 19. And there in the audience was Christine Moscal, who had participated in OpenLearning 18. So again, it was this face-to-face opportunity to meet someone that we had connected with through the CMOOC. And so that was very exciting. Gardner, Stephanie, any favorite moments from 18 in particular?
I was just thinking, you mentioned the EDUCAUSE conference where Mo was actually there and we were able to engage with him in person. I think that we can't forget about those moments, like you mentioned with you and Gardner going to the conference, all of those earlier times too, where we were able to, as we called it, take the show on the road.
Yes.
So those were very, very exciting opportunities to chat with people at ODU, to chat with people in Louisiana, to chat with people at the assessment conference in Richmond not too long ago. So those were all really, really wonderful opportunities for us to engage with open learning participants, but engage in person.
I had an interesting engagement this time that ended up being a way to draw somebody in. Okay, Mo, I see you, and I'll just finish this thought quickly. And
Sure.
Yeah, and I can hear you too. Great.
Oh.
I was teleporting into the Open Ed Symposium at Virginia Tech and engaged with a graduate student there, Rebecca Clark, who jumped into OpenLearning 19 and has been a great participant. But I was there through the robotic presence and interacted with her that way. And so, yeah, it was another, so that one was a little different, the reverse, because it was face-to-face, and then having her jump into the CMOOC. It was great. Mo, I'll turn it over to you to share your memories.
So my main experience was in OpenLearning 17. Those were back in the days when this was real rigor, 15 weeks. And not to say that I was, the model participant every week, but that was really an important time for me to become a part of this community, to connect with all of you, not only because it was around these interesting topics, but it was also a time of transition for me. I was getting ready to leave one position and wasn't sure what was coming next. And so that experience really gave me not only a connected learning community, but a community of support at a time of professional transition. Fortunately, I wound up in a very exciting new position now here at Grinnell College. And yes, there's the view. We're finally breaking into spring here in the Midwest. It's been a long winter. But I do, it's interesting that you recall that video that I did at that time. I think Laura Gogia was the person who was the catalyst for that. And I thought at the time, well, it's not something I've ever done, but hey, I can do this real quick. And it was fun. So it was my first, OpenLearning 17 was my first real experience of a kind of a CMOOC learning community environment. And so in that sense, it's been kind of a launching pad or a platform that gave me a sense of staying a part of this community, but also knowing what it would be like to explore other sort of similar learning spaces. And the interesting thing is that all among many things with regard to that was I just this past week had an English professor here at Grinnell who his name is Ralph Savarese, who wants to develop a kind of CMOOC, who wants to develop an online learning community around work that he's been doing for years, reading literature with people on the autism spectrum. And so one of my first thoughts was and he was looking for examples of maybe similar types of learning communities, and I pointed him right away to OpenLearning. Because that was my first thought, was that here was a model for how a group of people could come together in a platform and connect around ideas and learn from one another. So there've been multiple benefits I've experienced from that initial time at OpenLearning 17. And but yeah, it's just been wonderful to be to continue to be connected on Twitter and other spaces as well.
And Mo, you've been a great person for us to be able to pull in. I know you haven't been actively involved in 18 and 19, but for 19, one of the things we did that we decided to do that was a little bit different was we had this role of greeters, for lack of a better term, where we pulled in some people who had participated previously, particularly people who had participated more actively, and ask them if they would welcome the new people in OpenLearning 19. And it really was just that, if you can shout out on their blog posts or retweet something that they tweeted. And I really appreciated that we had you and a few others in that role to do that, because it was the Gardner and Sue show at the beginning of OpenLearning 19, so we needed all the help we can get. And so thanks again for jumping into that role. As Mo said, Autumm Caines has joined us. Welcome, Autumm. And if you will share a memory from anything you've experienced with any of the OpenLearning iterations.
I was just looking back at my blog, actually, because I realized that OpenLearning 17 inspired 2 different blog posts for me. One that I was thinking about the whole Cambridge Analytica micro-targeting kind of thing, and the idea of Vannevar Bush's As We May Think. I had one section of the blog post that was called As We May Forget. And just thinking about those connective trails and how those are definitely the way that we think, but if somebody can kind of watch them from like a meta level, how that could potentially be used against us. And then the other one I brought in was about free and how we mean free, and I think it was called something like When Free Beer Leaves Me Cold, because I had this realization that the grammar checking site Grammarly was really a keylogger, and that it was like tracking all of my keystrokes. And even though it was a free tool, it wasn't an open tool. Right? That even though everybody was like, oh, I mean, it's on YouTube, like the advertising for this thing is everywhere, right? And everybody's like, oh, it's so wonderful. Which also, I got started on that as well because I had a faculty member who was sending me some emails, and like these emails were huge. like I would go to sort at that institution, we had a limit on our mailbox, and our mailboxes would fill up and then you had to clean them out kind of thing. And I would always sort by size and see what are the ones with the big attachments that are taking stuff up. And his emails had no attachments on them whatsoever. It'd be like one sentence and it would be this huge email. And I was like, what is going on with this? And the instructional designer we had at the time, him and I dug into this thing and we found so much code in the background of these emails. And I mean, like, I'm not a coder, but just reading through this stuff, the word Grammarly kept showing up over and over and over again. And he had the plugin, and the plugin was having these issues on the back end. And so I brought that into some of my open learning thinking around, what does it mean when we say open? What does it mean when we say free? How are these tools, you know, how are we playing with these tools? What are they really giving us? What are we giving them? What does it mean when it's free? What's the product, right? So that's just, yeah, I was just thinking and just going back to my blog and thinking about some of the stuff that I've done. I do think I've been probably a bad MOOC student in terms of being persistent throughout an entire iteration, but I think I've kind of dove into all the open learnings and just sort of popped in for a second to say hello, do a blog post, something like this, just pop in and say hi. And I'm just so grateful for it because it's a huge part of my learning as a professional, and it's a huge part of how I stay connected. And so having these kind of events, having these kind of courses, being able to dip in and dip out, it just means a lot to me. So thank you guys so much for putting it on.
Oh, that's great to hear. Stephanie probably has a lot to say about the experience for people participating in MOOCs in general, but CMOOCs more particularly. I know we had some conversations in the steering committee about kind of what is normal behavior. And I think, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what I remember you talking about in particular was that that's pretty normal, that we shouldn't take that as a sign of failure if somebody's dropping out, that, you know, this is part of the nature of the beast. That and Autumm, I think what you're saying is helpful because it sort of affirms that there's value in the dropping in and from time to time, whether you drop in once or drop in periodically over the course of a CMOOC. Stephanie, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, because the idea of persistence, right, changes with this different way of engaging with each other and engaging with materials. And so sometimes when we have new things, we have to have a new way of understanding them, a new way of assessing them, a new way of talking about them. And so when we see people pop in and pop out, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be viewed a completely different way. And so I think that one of the things that MOOCs in general have done, they've brought that conversation to the fore. So what does it mean to be engaged? And does engagement mean different things in different spaces at different times? Which I think is a really interesting conversation to have, because people, when they pop back in, just because they popped out for a minute doesn't mean presence is something different, right? They could still be thinking about things, engaging in activities that are connected to what you're talking about in the CMOOC or XMOOC, and come back with something else to share. So the idea of engagement can be viewed differently, as well as the idea of persistence, I think.
I think too, some of the assessment that we did in Open Learning 17, I remember Steve Greenlaw did a follow-up survey with people really trying to target people who had dropped out at one point and trying to figure out why, you know, what happened. And I think a lot of times it was life got in the way. I know even as a member of the steering committee, that happened for me. There were a couple of weeks where I just had to check out because stuff happened. And that assessment, sort of the summary of that assessment, is in the video, the throwback video to Open Learning 17 that is one of the things we've featured for this week of Open Learning 19, is that some of that assessment kind of getting at what people took. I mean, it turned out, I think for the most part, even the people who had to drop out took something valuable from that experience. And we've intentionally, and Gardner, maybe you want to say something about this as well, we've intentionally played around with the duration as the iterations have gone along. So Open Learning 17 was either 15 or 17 weeks, somewhere around that time frame, basically a semester long. And that is a long time to try to persist. Some of our students have trouble persisting that long. And then Open Learning 18, we cut it in half, so it was 7 weeks. And we added the bonus pre-MOOC week to try to help new people. And that seemed to be a valuable part of the experience, because it can be kind of overwhelming to be new in that environment without some kind of coaching or guidance. For Open Learning 17, we had Laura Gogia, who was the Connected Learning Coach, or the Open Learning Coach. And then, of course, for this iteration, pared it down even further. 3 weeks. The pre-MOOC week makes the 4th week. So much shorter duration. I do think we've had some people who've made it to the end, but even there, I think people, people's at least visible participation, so they're either tweeting or they're blogging or they're retweeting or commenting on somebody else's blog, that comes and goes. We're all really busy people, and so that's part of it. Gardner, is there anything else you want to add to that conversation about the duration and kind of what happens in a CMOOC with tuning in and tuning out?
I fundamentally agree that the assessment should not judge the experience of failure if people are coming in and out. I do an all-day, formerly all-night, Paradise Lost readathon every year that I teach Milton, and I tell people the mantra is, come when you can, leave when you must. Better to be there for one book of Paradise Lost than not to be there at all, and you'll have some of that experience. All of that said, there is another voice in my head that says, for the best results, start at the beginning and go all the way through to the end, because there's something that you'll take from that experience that doesn't come any other way. And it's okay. Not everybody has to have that part of the experience. I understand that. And I continue to marvel at how much value people can get out of just being there for a week or maybe an event. I think today's a great example of that. At the same time, there in each of the cases, there was a kind of an integrity to the design that had something to do, in my mind, not just with, well, let's do another thing and another thing and another thing, but there was a kind of an arc to it. And the one that was most intentional and most difficult is the one that Mo has described as having rigor, which I think is, rigor gets a bad rap because it's what happens when you die, right? But I think of rigor, I was once asked to define it, and I just came up with, I don't know if this is true or not, or even a good definition, but the first thing that came up in my head was honesty. That is to say, everybody understands there are 50 shades of open, everything is very complicated, and there's a variety of ways to think about what open means. So let's be honest about that and explore as many things as possible and open ourselves to as many different complexities as possible. So that first iteration really was, it was pretty intense. It was a long arc. It had instances where people had to bear down and read and study things if they wanted to, really participate. And Autumm just spoke to occasions she had to blog in response to those long readings. I knew that would be difficult. I knew asking people to blog would be difficult. I knew asking people to tweet would be difficult. But there was an opportunity there that it was interesting to me. There were so many strands I was very aware of trying to weave together. There was the State Council for Higher Education in Virginia. There was the larger network of people who were really kind of already curious about or participating in varieties of open learning. There were the people on the steering committee who had their ideas and contributions to make. Some of them were faculty, some of them worked in libraries, and sometimes those are faculty and sometimes not. We had instructional, kind of ed tech people. We had some faculty. We had people who were new, people who had done this before. And then we had this big canvas to paint on. And one of the things that I really didn't think about again until just now is that in addition to we're going to focus, it's a long, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. We're going to go through all of these things and weave these strands together, including aac&u, very deliberately with Brett Einen and Randy Bass at the end. But the other thing was we had a big enough canvas that we could bring in a lot of voices in a sustained way, which is kind of interesting. We had a different director for each week, and sometimes one director would do more than 1 week. We had Laura Gogia as a connected learning coach. We had Brian Alexander coming in and talking at one point. We had Brett Einen, we had Randy Bass, we had Susan Albertine, we had Beverly Covington, as she was known then, and we had all of the Chev people, participating in some way. I think everybody on the steering committee had a week that they directed. And it was interesting to me to watch how that would happen. The weeks were very different, but they were all kind of clustered around a similar set of ideas and approaches in a way that generated a kind of interesting alignment, but also useful diversity, which is probably the hardest thing of all. Useful alignment, but also interesting diversity. That's really, really difficult. But if you hit that, some interesting things can happen. So yeah, it was really long, and heaven knows I was fading by the end, big time. But I'm struck by the way in which once we got to the end, that farewell video still has a number of different voices there and reflecting on something that was kind of awesome to have made it through. But of course, one of the lessons is do what you can while you can, because money always runs out. And when money runs out, it gets really difficult to sustain anything. So I guess I would also say that I am just super proud and humbled by the efforts of the people on the steering committee who hung in there pro bono for the second iteration and hung in there pro bono for the third iteration, because it was conversation and networking were at the heart of it, but it took a lot of doing, and there are a lot of logistics involved, and it was always set up to be a kind of a course of study that would add up to something over the experience, and so I think that's what's in common over all of those arcs. But yeah, we really climbed a tall mountain that first time. That was pretty amazing.
I think all of you on the steering committee and who have worked on this really should feel proud of the work you've done. I mean, and you don't always see down the line the effects of that either. Even if people maybe dip out for a while, they've taken what they've experienced here and are using it perhaps in other contexts as well. I mean, I remember. It was. Like Autumm, I had some of my best blog posts, those sessions with John Udell and Jeremy Dean, or with Doug Engelbart and Ted Nelson. And it was really my first kind of sustained working through that material, starting with Vinnie Varbush and going through some of those pioneers in this field. And then, coming all to the end with, as you said, with Randy Bass and Brett. There was just a lot of really good stuff there, and the benefits I've experienced from having worked through some of those ideas with you all, have just been ongoing. And I'm serendipitously, I'm going to get a chance in another context to kind of go through some of those. I think I got the last spot in Howard Rheingold's upcoming, he's doing a thing on augmented collective intelligence. And we're going to do a dive. I think there's a little more structure there. I don't know. It's interesting to compare the different kind of CMOOC experiences. He capped it at 30. So, but like I say, having gone through OpenLearning 17, it's just given me the kind of started me on a trajectory of these kind of opportunities, and I'm just very grateful for that.
That is awesome to hear. I think one of the things, you talked about structure, and I was thinking about this a little bit, listening to Gardner as well. One of the things that has been very intentionally a part of the structure that we have provided in the 3 iterations is supporting learner agency. So we've always tried to give a variety of experiences that people could participate in, whether it's a reading and annotation. There's almost always an annotation along with the reading now, or participating in something on Twitter or blogging, or watching a video and reacting, and giving people the option, tweet something out about it, blog about it. That's sort of like the quick response versus the maybe more prolonged response that a blog post would require. And so I think that's been a really important piece as well. But I think it's also one of the challenges, because it means that not all of us have read the same thing, if there were multiple readings offered. And particularly, I think in that first iteration, we had some heavy readings in there. And I know I myself, had some challenges with at least one of them. And, so I may have read it, but it wasn't visible that I had read it, because I was still processing it and I wasn't ready to share about it. But reading what others had to say really helped. So I think the learner agency has been a really important aspect of it. So it might be a good time to kind of talk about what we think might be next. And I don't think we have anything definite about that, but as Gardner says, when the money runs out, it's hard to live on altruism for a prolonged period. I think we've done an amazing job with these last 2 iterations, and I too am grateful for the people who hung in there and helped out with that. Gardner and I have been talking a little bit. Number one, there's the value of the OpenLearningHub.net. That's out there. It's going to live on. We've talked about being committed to keeping it updated, adding things to it occasionally. It might be something that one of us is doing from another project that maybe is related, or pulling something in that we think would be interesting. And then we've also talked about maybe for next year during Open Education Week, using that as a time to point people to the OpenLearningHub.net as a resource. So tweeting maybe the link to one of the videos or something like that, or one of the readings, as a way to kind of keep the spirit alive. If others have thoughts or ideas, I'd be interested to hear about them, but that's just a couple of the ways we thought the experience could live on a little bit with a lower maintenance mode.
Well, I like the idea of the reunion call. Could we keep that going? Could we do a reunion call once every year, once every couple of years? That's kind of fun.
If you guys will show up, I would love to do that. You know how it is with any reunion. Like you can throw the party, but if nobody shows up, I would love to do this again and have people show up. And I mean, people could talk about, I loved hearing Mo's experience of how open learning has lived on and influenced some of the work that he's doing now. So, maybe that's the experience piece. How are you taking what you learned in any of the iterations of open learning, and how are you using them today? That would be a really fun way to update it. So thanks, Autumm. I love that suggestion.
There's one thing about the architecture I might mention, which was yet another in the long list of things that puzzled people, which was kind of interesting. I mean, as a teacher, I'm just about as interested in what puzzles people as what they understand, because I'm always kind of testing that. What explanation got through? How does this actually work? And the thing I'd mention is the syndication that's at the heart of OpenLearningHub.net. When I was first trying to explain this to Susan Albertine, she said, well, she said a couple things. She said, first of all, faculty won't blog. You can't get them to blog. And I said, well, but I'm faculty and I blog. So clearly you can get faculty to blog. Maybe you just can't get them all to blog. And I said, it will be interesting to see what happens. And she said, oh, okay. She said, well, what are they going to do? They're going to come in and write on this website. And I said, no, they're not going to write on the website. They're going to write in their blogs, and that will syndicate into the website. And I kind of explained a little bit of the technical stuff behind that, which is really not that difficult to understand. But as John Udell likes to point out, we don't have any equivalents in the physical world. So it's a hard thing to imagine. Here it is. You write something in your space that you're thinking about, and automagically, if it's the kind of thing that you have tagged as relevant to open learning, it will simply be republished on openlearninghub.net. And the great value there is that the hub just keeps on churning. And Sue and I noted this when we started, blowing off the dust and turning the lights back on in preparation for Open Learning 19. There are a bunch of new blog posts there. Well, how did that happen? Because people kept blogging and they kept tagging things Open Learning. Well, that's kind of a miracle if you think about it. And very different from the usual model of come and put your stuff here, write your stuff here, and it will stay here at this place that is here. And then it kind of all depends on whether anybody is there to see if there's a here still, and quickly can turn into a kind of a repository model. What we've got on openlearninghub.net, which is something I learned from all the people who taught me syndication, is that you don't want to start a repository, because that's where you go to repose. What you want to do is find a way to make it a dynamic kind of an ecosystem. There will be resources that do live there, but they're syndicated in from YouTube. There will be new blog posts that have nothing to do with a particular iteration of open learning. They're participants who continue to tag their posts that way. And so one of the things that will keep happening that I think is just spectacular is that it'll keep going. It just has a little kind of a perpetual motion part to it that I hope people learn from. The idea here is that the web has certain properties, if they're understood and used well, that really do demonstrate how the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And we all can be a part of that together. That to me is the fundamental lesson behind open learning. And I'm just really delighted that this stuff happens, outside of any particular person thinking about it. I think it's just wonderful.
Any other last thoughts as we wrap up the reunion?
So I was just going to say, I'm really very happy to hear that the hub site is going to live on, and I hadn't really thought about continuing to tag blog posts with open learning, but I think that's a great idea. I mean, it gives me a reason to keep coming back to the hub, and I would really appreciate that. That would be wonderful.
Autumm?
I was just going to say thank you again for doing it, and for doing it pro bono for the last 2 years. I've done smaller things on my own, just kind of because of the love of it, and it takes an incredible amount of energy and time, just in terms of the work that you put in, but there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into it too, because a lot of times you're working with, anytime you're working with people, right, you have that piece of it. And yeah, it's just been an amazing node in my networked learning. So thank you for doing it.
And thank you for all of you being nodes. That's what makes it all work. is the people. As Gardner said, I think it was towards the end of Open Learning 17, Gardner, that you came up with that great phrase, the network is the deliverable. So, you know, I think if we've been able to deliver anything, it's the opportunity to connect and reconnect. The syndication helps with that. These reunions will help with that. So I love that idea of doing this again. Thanks to everyone who participated today. It was wonderful to see you again or hear from you again. For those who are watching a recording of this, please consider tweeting or blogging about your experiences with any of the iterations of Open Learning. I'd love to see what people have been able to take away from this experience. So thank you so much. It really only works because of participation. So thank you all for that. Peace out.
Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Be well.